Elliot Graves woke up to the suffocating weight of silence. Not the kind of silence that came with dawn, soft and peaceful, but an unnatural, suffocating void, as if the world outside had stopped breathing. No hum of distant traffic, no footsteps from his upstairs neighbor, no chirping birds, no faint murmurs of early risers shuffling in the hallways. Just nothing. His eyelids were heavy, sleep clinging to him like a second skin, but something felt wrong. A deep, gut-level wrong. He swallowed against the dryness in his throat, his body tense before his mind could even understand why. He rolled over, reaching for his phone on the nightstand. The screen was already lit up. An emergency alert. But it wasn't like any alert he had ever seen before. The text was distorted. The words were scrambled, breaking apart and reforming as if they were alive, shifting on their own. The font flickered in and out of clarity, glitching like a corrupted file. Some people, not real, do not. His pulse slowed. His brain fought to process what he was looking at. His thumb hovered over the screen, hesitant, instinctively afraid to touch it. And then, the message vanished. No notification, no trace, just his home screen staring back at him, the time blinking 3:47 a.m. A deep, unsettling cold spread through his chest. Had it been real? A trick of the screen? A dream bleeding into wakefulness? He tapped his notifications, scrolling, but there was nothing. No missed alerts, no government warnings, no texts, no missed calls. Nothing. The silence in his apartment grew louder. With a shaky exhale, he swung his legs over the bed and stood, the wooden floor cold against his bare feet. He rubbed his face, trying to shake off the creeping unease curling at the edges of his consciousness. It was just a glitch, that's all. A stupid, meaningless glitch. But then, why did it feel like something was watching him? His skin prickled. He turned his head slowly toward his bedroom window. The blinds were shut. They had been shut all night. But in the thin slit between the slats, there was something off about the darkness outside. It wasn't moving. It wasn't like the usual nighttime stillness. No shifting shadows, no occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car. It was frozen, like a photograph. A deep, sickening instinct buried in his bones told him, do not open the blinds. His fingers twitched toward them anyway. But just before he could reach out, bang, a single, sharp knock at his bedroom door. His heart stopped. The air in the apartment crackled. His breathing hitched. His door, not his front door. His bedroom door. The one that was supposed to be locked. The one that led into his own damn apartment. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. A paralysis of pure, ancient terror rooted him to the spot. The silence pressed in, thick and absolute. Then, bang, louder this time. Elliot took a single step back, his heartbeat thundering. His breath came in short, jagged gasps. He reached for anything, a weapon, a phone, something, but his hands were slick with sweat. His fingers barely managed to grasp his phone, trembling as he checked the screen. No new notifications. He wasn't breathing. He needed to breathe. Slowly, he forced himself forward, step by step. His legs felt wrong, unsteady, foreign, like they weren't quite his. His hand reached for the doorknob. He hesitated. Then, he yanked it open. Nothing. The hallway was empty. No one was there. No sign of anything. Just the same dimly lit passage leading to his living room. His own breathing felt too loud in the stillness. He exhaled, laughing weakly. His nerves were shot. Maybe he had imagined the sound. Maybe he was just... The bathroom door creaked open by itself. A small, hollow noise crawled up his throat. The door had been shut. He knew it had been shut, but now it stood open. Just a few inches, but enough to reveal the mirror inside. Enough to reveal his reflection. His heart seized, because his reflection wasn't moving. For a full, excruciating moment, Elliot stood frozen in place, staring at himself, his own lifeless twin standing motionless in the dim bathroom light. Then, like a glitching screen, his reflection caught up. His mirrored self jerked, as if suddenly remembering it needed to move, a split-second delay. Not much, just a hair's breadth off, but enough to be wrong. His stomach lurched. He stumbled back, slamming the bathroom door shut. His hands were shaking so violently, he barely managed to keep his grip on the doorknob. He needed to get out. Coffee, fresh air, something normal. He grabbed his jacket, his keys, yanking open the front door so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet. But the second he stepped into the hallway, he felt it. The air was vibrating, not a sound, not a hum, something deeper. a static-like pressure thrumming through the floor and through the walls, through his bones. His breath hitched. The entire building felt wrong. His fingers twitched as he locked his door, pulse hammering. And then, somewhere behind him, someone whispered his name, very, very softly. Elliot? It didn't sound human. He didn't look back. He ran. The cold air slapped Elliot's face as he sprinted down the sidewalk, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The city was waking up. Cars rolling down the street, people walking, lights flickering on in nearby apartments. But everything felt wrong. Like a stage play where the actors didn't quite know their lines. He didn't dare check behind him. His apartment building faded into the distance as he made a beeline toward the one place that still felt real. The small coffee shop a few blocks down, where Riley Carter was probably waiting for him. He needed to see his best friend. He needed something normal. The bell above the shop door jingled as he stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe wrapping around him. The scent of coffee beans and pastries was familiar, grounding. The soft hum of conversation and clinking mugs should have been comforting. But something was off. His eyes immediately landed on Riley, sitting at their usual table near the window. Relief flooded him for half a second, until he noticed the way Riley was looking at him. Riley's face was stretched into a grin, wide, too wide. His teeth were bared, his lips pulled back at an unnatural angle. His eyes, they weren't blinking. Not once. Elliot hesitated mid-step. Had Riley always smiled like that? Then, suddenly, Riley blinked, too fast, too many times in a row, like a skipping film reel. He gave his head a little shake, then raised a hand in greeting. Dude, you okay? Elliot swallowed hard, forcing himself forward. Yeah, just rough morning. His voice came out shaky, the words sticking to the roof of his mouth. Riley laughed, easy and natural, too natural, like it had been rehearsed. Elliot slid into the seat across from him, studying his friend. Riley was acting normal now, but that smile still lingered at the edges of his expression, like his face wasn't sure whether to stop grinning or not. You look like you saw a ghost, Riley said, stirring his coffee. Elliot gave a tight laugh. Not far off. Before Riley could respond, Elliot's eyes flickered toward the counter. The barista was just standing there. A young woman in a green apron, unmoving, her hands at her sides, eyes locked on something far away. She wasn't preparing orders. She wasn't talking. She wasn't blinking. A customer cleared his throat. Hello? The barista didn't react. The man shifted uncomfortably. Miss? The barista's head jerked to the side, too fast, like a puppet being yanked by a string. Her mouth opened, but she didn't speak. Not right away. Then, in a flat, empty monotone, she said, "What would you like to order?" Elliot's stomach tightened. The man hesitated, then muttered, "Just a black coffee." For a moment, the barista didn't move. Then, like a video buffering back to life, she snapped into motion, robotic and mechanical, repeating, "Black coffee. That will be $3. The man gave her a wary look as he slid a few bills across the counter. The barista didn't react right away. She just stood there, staring at the money like she didn't quite recognize it, before slowly, too slowly, picking it up. Elliot's fingers dug into his chair. Something was wrong with her. Something was wrong with all of this. Elliot? He snapped his head back toward Riley and nearly recoiled. Riley was staring at him, unblinking, motionless, not smiling, not fidgeting, just staring. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. Riley? For 3 unbearable seconds, Riley didn't move. Then, like a switch flipping back on, Riley let out a short, breathy laugh. Dude, relax, he grinned, shaking his head. You're acting weird today. Elliot forced out a chuckle, but his skin felt too tight. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. Still, he went through the motions, ordering his coffee. His voice sounded far away from himself as he spoke. And when the barista repeated his order back to him, her voice was identical to how she had spoken to the last customer. No change in inflection, no recognition, just the exact same words, the same rhythm, as if she had memorized a script. Elliot turned back to Riley, trying to ground himself, trying to breathe. His best friend was laughing at something on his phone, sipping his drink like nothing had happened. Elliot clenched his fists under the table. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he was imagining things. But then, his eyes drifted toward the bulletin board near the entrance. Tacked among the usual flyers and advertisements was a missing person poster. Elliot's stomach dropped, because it was Riley's face, staring back at him, The breath rushed out of his lungs. It was him. Same scruffy blonde hair, same sharp jawline, same easy grin. But underneath the picture, the name was wrong. Jared Collins. And the date? Missing for 3 days. Elliot's fingers turned numb. His entire body went cold. Slowly, mechanically, he turned toward Riley, who was still scrolling through his phone, completely unaware. Elliot's pulse hammered against his ribs. Hey, His voice barely worked. Riley? Yeah? Riley looked up, taking a sip of coffee. Elliot's hand shook as he pointed at the board. Do you see that? Riley followed his gaze, his brow furrowing. Then, his face cleared. He let out a short, amused chuckle. There's nothing there, dude. Elliot's blood turned to ice. He snapped his gaze back to the board. The poster was gone. His breath caught in his throat. His hands curled into fists beneath the table, his nails biting into his skin. Riley was watching him now, his head tilted slightly, like a confused animal. You sure you're okay? Riley asked. Elliot swallowed hard. He forced a nod. Riley grinned. All right, good. 'Cause seriously, man, you're acting weird today. Elliot just stared at him, unable to shake the thought pounding in his skull. The thought that wouldn't leave him alone. What if Riley isn't real? Elliot forced a laugh, too hollow, too forced. Yeah, I'm fine, he muttered, finishing the last sip of his now cold coffee. Riley smiled, but Elliot didn't meet his eyes. He couldn't. His hands were shaking. He left the coffee shop in a daze, Riley's voice trailing behind him. Something about catching up later, something about acting normal. Elliot barely heard it. The streets bustled around him, but the city felt wrong, like the air itself was thicker, heavier. Pedestrians moved at a slightly off rhythm, some too fast, some too slow. A man across the street stopped mid-step, one foot hovering over the pavement for several seconds before he moved again, completely unaware that he'd paused at all. Elliot walked faster. The looming glass structure of his office building came into view, and for the first time ever, he hesitated before stepping inside. He'd worked here for years. Same dull gray cubicles, same clicking keyboards, same stale coffee machine in the break room. But as he swiped his ID badge and pushed through the glass doors, his stomach twisted. Something was wrong. The receptionist, Emily, sat at her desk as usual, but her hands were completely still on her keyboard. Her fingers were hovering just above the keys, not moving, not typing. Her eyes were locked on the screen, and her lips were moving silently, as if she was reading something to herself, but no sound came out. Elliot's breath hitched. He walked past quickly, pretending not to notice. Inside, the open office buzzed with artificial lighting and murmured conversations, but something was missing. The small human details. No one was fidgeting. No one was tapping their pens or checking their phones or stretching their arms. They were all just working. Efficient. Precise. Too precise. Elliot's eyes darted toward the familiar desk near his own. Megan Holloway. She was already looking at him. She smiled, bright and cheerful, but she held it too long. Way too long. Like she'd frozen mid-expression. Morning, Elliot, she chirped, and finally, she let the smile fade, but it didn't feel natural. It felt forced. Elliot nodded stiffly. Morning. He tried to focus. Just get to your desk. Just work. Act normal. But as he walked past the rows of cubicles, the wrongness crawled under his skin. A man at the copier machine had stopped halfway through reaching for his papers. Completely still. His arm outstretched, fingers inches from the stack of documents. He wasn't blinking. He wasn't moving. Then, all at once, he snapped back to life and grabbed the papers as if nothing had happened. Elliot's pulse hammered. At another desk, Julia from accounting was speaking to someone, but then she repeated the exact same sentence. Word for word, same inflection, same tone. Like a glitch in a recording. Elliot's hands clenched into fists. He picked up his pace. The screens were flickering, too. Every time someone walked past a monitor, the display glitched. Just for a second, like a brief static ripple. Then it was normal again. No one else reacted. They all acted like nothing was wrong. Elliot sat at his desk, forcing himself to focus. He logged into his computer, took a slow, steady breath. Work, just work. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. The screen flickered. Then, a blank text document opened by itself. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The cursor blinked, and then letters began typing on their own. Slowly, methodically. Some people are not real anymore. Do not acknowledge them. His blood turned to ice. His mouth went dry as he stared at the words, his heart slamming against his ribs. Then, Just as suddenly as it appeared, the text deleted itself, gone, like it had never been there. Elliot's chair creaked as he pushed back slightly, his breath shallow. He looked around. Megan was watching him. Her expression hadn't changed, her smile still faintly lingering, but her eyes were too focused, too intent. His skin crawled. "Everything okay, Elliot?" she asked, tilting her head just slightly too far. Her voice was too even, too smooth, like she was reading from a script. Elliot swallowed. "Yeah," he lied. "Just a long night." Megan's smile widened. "Good," she said. "You looked a little off for a second there." Elliot forced a laugh, gripping his desk to steady himself. He needed to leave. Now. Because one thought was drilling into his skull, louder than anything else. What if Megan isn't real either? Elliot could feel Megan's gaze burning into his back as he grabbed his things and rushed out of the office. He barely muttered an excuse, something about feeling sick. No one stopped him. No one even reacted. The elevator ride down felt too long. His reflection in the mirrored walls seemed to lag, just like it had that morning. By the time he stepped onto the street, his breaths were shallow and uneven. He needed to clear his head. He needed to talk to someone real. Mr. Dawson. The old man had lived in the building longer than anyone else. A little paranoid, a little odd, but always sharp. Elliot had once helped him carry groceries upstairs, and since then, Dawson had taken to watching out for him. If there was anyone who would understand this creeping wrongness, it was him. Elliot walked fast, every shadow stretching too long in the setting sun. When he reached his apartment building, he didn't go to his own unit. He went straight to Dawson's door. His fist pounded against the wood. "Mr. Dawson?" For a long moment, nothing. Then, shuffling. The door cracked open just an inch. A bloodshot eye peered through. Elliot barely recognized the man behind it. Mr. Dawson looked exhausted. His skin was pale, his cheeks sunken, dark circles carved under his eyes. The deep wrinkles on his face seemed more pronounced, like something had been eating away at him from the inside. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Dawson's voice was barely above a whisper. Elliot's breath hitched. Mr. Dawson's hand shook as he unlatched the door and pulled it open. "Get in? Quick?" Elliot stepped inside, and the first thing he noticed was the windows. They were completely covered, layer after layer of newspaper, taped down so not a single crack remained. The TV was unplugged. The phone had been ripped from the wall. The lights were dim, almost too dim. The air smelled stale, like no one had left in days. Dawson locked the door behind him. Elliot swallowed hard. "Mr. Dawson, what's going on?" The old man grabbed his wrist too tight. "They aren't real anymore, boy," he whispered. "They walk, talk, and smile, but they ain't right, and the more you notice them, the more they notice you." Elliot's stomach dropped. "Who?" he asked, but his voice was weak. He already knew the answer. Mr. Dawson's grip trembled. "The ones that lag, the ones that pause, the ones that forget to act human." Elliot felt ice crawl up his spine. His voice barely came out. "Riley? Megan?" Dawson's expression darkened. "They took my wife," he whispered. "A week ago, she sat right where you're sitting. I made her coffee, asked her how she slept, and his breath shuddered. She just froze, mid-sip. Cup to her lips, just stopped for a whole damn minute." Elliot's hands clenched into fists. Then, just like that, she started again, like nothing happened, smiled at me. But it wasn't her smile. It was wrong, too wide, too perfect. Dawson blinked hard, as if trying to hold back something deep and broken. "I asked her something only she would know. Something from before we moved here. She didn't answer right away. She had to." He licked his lips. "She had to think about it." His voice cracked. "She wasn't my wife anymore." Elliot's breath came sharp and shallow. "What did you do?" Dawson's eyes flickered to the corner of the room. Elliot followed his gaze and froze. There, in the shadows, pushed against the wall, was a woman's body, perfectly still, her face turned away, hidden beneath long strands of dark hair. Elliot's stomach twisted. "Jesus Christ." Dawson shook his head. "Don't look." His fingers dug into Elliot's arm. "It ain't her. It looks like her, but it ain't." Elliot wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to get out. But then, Mr. Dawson stopped moving, mid-breath, mid-blink, just froze. His mouth was still open, as if he had been about to say something else. His fingers were locked around Elliot's wrist, but nothing moved. Not his chest, not his eyes. He was stuck. Elliot's own breath stuttered. He tried to yank his hand away. Dawson's grip held firm. Too firm. The old man's fingers trembled just slightly. Then he moved again. like nothing had happened. His grip loosened, and he let out a slow, shaking breath. "You should go home, son," Dawson said. His face hadn't changed. His tone was the same, but something was wrong. Something was wrong. Elliot yanked his arm free and stumbled back toward the door. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. Dawson just watched him, expression blank. Elliot reached for the door handle, his fingers sweaty, slipping. Then, Dawson smiled, too wide, too perfect. Elliot ran. Elliot barreled down the hallway, his pulse hammering in his ears. The air in Dawson's apartment had felt thick, suffocating, like he had been standing in something dead. Now, outside, the air was too open, too still. His chest heaved as he sprinted across the parking lot, past cars that felt too empty, past buildings that looked too quiet. Then, his phone buzzed. Elliot's heart lurched. With shaking hands, he pulled it from his pocket. Another emergency alert. But this one wasn't like before. This one was clearer. Do not speak to them. Do not acknowledge them. Do not attempt to leave. Elliot's blood ran cold. His breath came short, frantic. The letters burned into his vision. Then a strange sensation crawled up his spine. He was being watched. Slowly, terrified to look, Elliot lifted his eyes. The man was there, across the street, standing exactly where he had been that morning. Same posture, same angle, same stare. Elliot's fingers tightened around his phone. No. The man hadn't moved all day. Had he? He was still wearing the same jacket, the same shoes. His arms were still limp at his sides. His face was still slack, expressionless. And his eyes were locked onto Elliot, unblinking, unmoving, wrong. Elliot's breath came out shaky. He turned and ran. He didn't care where. He just needed to be around people. People who were real. The grocery store was ahead, bright, open, crowded. Elliot practically stumbled inside. The overhead lights buzzed softly. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant filled his nose. Muzak played faintly through the speakers. Normal. This was normal. His legs felt weak as he made his way toward the front. He just needed to breathe, to think. A cashier stood behind the register. Elliot grabbed a random item, a bottled water, and approached the counter. The cashier's hands moved in mechanical motions. Beep, scan, beep, scan. Elliot barely glanced up until he noticed something. The man wasn't blinking. Not once. Elliot swallowed, shifting uncomfortably. The cashier's movements were too fluid, too perfect. Beep, scan. Finally, Elliot couldn't take it. He cleared his throat. "Hey man, busy day?" The cashier's hands froze. For a full 3 seconds, he didn't move. Then, his body reset. His shoulders twitched, his head jerked slightly. And then, in a flat, monotone voice, "Busy day," the cashier repeated. The exact same way Elliot had said it. Every syllable. Identical. Elliot felt his stomach turn. He grabbed his water and turned away fast, his skin crawling. Then, the customer beside him glitched. Elliot saw it in the corner of his eye. A man, mid-conversation, froze. His mouth hung slightly open. His hands were raised, as if in the middle of a gesture. He stayed like that, unmoving, for at least 5 seconds. Then he reset. No acknowledgement, no hesitation. Just continued the conversation. Elliot's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. He stepped away, fast, his eyes darting toward the front doors, and his breath hitched. The man across the street was standing at the entrance, closer now, just beyond the glass doors. Not moving, not blinking, just staring, right at Elliot. Elliot's breath came in short, uneven gasps as he shoved his way out of the grocery store. The man across the street didn't move, didn't react. But Elliot could feel his eyes on him. He didn't look, didn't dare. He kept his head down, fists clenched, and bolted toward his apartment. The streets felt emptier. The sky above was a strange shade of gray. Not quite night, not quite day. The sounds of the city felt wrong, distant, hollow, like an abandoned film set, still playing its pre-recorded ambience. Elliot ran. He didn't stop until he was inside his apartment, door slammed, locks bolted, chain secured. His hands shook as he braced himself against the door. His lungs ached, his head pounded, and his entire body felt like it was trying to crawl out of itself. He needed something, anything, to ground himself. The TV. He grabbed the remote and turned it on. Static. Every channel. No news, no shows, no sound, just the hissing of white noise. Then, a flicker, a sharp, jarring glitch across the screen, and suddenly, the emergency broadcast system alert. The screen shifted to a red warning banner, text flashing in sharp, bold letters. Emergency alert. Do not make eye contact. Do not let them know you see them. Elliot's stomach twisted. A voice followed, garbled, warped, barely human. Some people are not real anymore. The voice crackled, distorting, dragging out syllables in unnatural tones. They are replacing, they are learning, they are spreading. Elliot's fingers dug into the couch, his skin prickled. The tall ones are watching. A deep, static buzz overtook the voice, distorting it further, like it was struggling to form words. The screen glitched. The text disappeared. Then, new footage appeared. Security camera footage. Elliot's stomach turned to ice. It was his apartment, a grainy overhead view of him, sitting in his living room, watching the broadcast. His pulse hammered. This wasn't live TV. This was now. Elliot looked at the screen, heart pounding so violently it felt like his ribs might crack. And then, something moved. In the footage, behind him. A shape. Tall, unnaturally tall. Its head nearly touched the ceiling. Elliot's entire body seized. It was standing just behind the couch, behind him. Watching, not moving, watching. Elliot's hands clenched the arms of the chair. His breath turned shallow. The footage flickered. The thing behind him tilted its head. Elliot spun around. Nothing. The room was empty. No shadow, no figure, nothing at all. But the air felt thick, heavy, like something was still there, watching, waiting. Elliot turned back to the TV, his hands ice cold, his skin crawling with something primal. The footage was gone, back to static, back to silence. Elliot didn't move, didn't breathe, because suddenly, he wasn't sure if he was alone anymore. Elliot's breath came in short, uneven gasps. His hands clenched into fists, his entire body locking up as a cold weight settled in his chest. The apartment was silent. Too silent. His pulse pounded in his ears as he slowly stepped away from the TV, his movements stiff, mechanical, like his body wasn't fully his anymore. Then, his phone rang. The sharp sound shattered the silence like a gunshot. Elliot flinched, heart lurching into his throat. His hands trembled as he dug into his pocket, pulling out the phone. Riley. His best friend's name flashed on the screen. Elliot stared at it. His thumb hovered over the screen. Every instinct screamed at him not to pick up, not to answer. But he did. He pressed the call button and slowly brought the phone to his ear. Silence. Then, a voice. Familiar. Deeply familiar. Elliot. Elliot's blood turned to ice. Stop noticing, Riley's voice whispered. The sound warped like it was coming through layers of static. A slow, unnatural pause. Stop looking. Another pause. Too long. Or they'll replace you too. The call cut off. A dead tone hummed in Elliot's ear. His breath hitched. A slow, crawling dread crept up his spine as he lowered the phone. His vision blurred at the edges, his mind buzzing, like a frequency he couldn't tune out. His hands felt numb. Stop noticing. His knees felt weak. Stop looking. Elliot turned and froze. The window. The glass was dark, reflecting the dim glow of his apartment. But something was wrong. His reflection. It wasn't moving. Elliot's pulse slammed against his ribs. He lifted his hand, but his reflection didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, smiling, too wide, too unnatural, like it had been waiting for him to notice. The lights in his apartment flickered, the TV glitched, his vision skipped. For a brief, terrible second, everything froze. Then, the world snapped. Like an old film reel burning through, the edges of reality melted, turning black. The walls rippled. The floor beneath him wavered. The TV screen flared with a final silent burst of static before cutting to black. Elliot's reflection tilted its head, still grinning, still staring. Elliot tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. His arms wouldn't move. His body wasn't his anymore. A deep, inhuman hum filled the air, vibrating through his skull. A slow, deafening realization crawled into his mind. Elliot is no longer real. He had been replaced.